Hi there, I'm Renee Jones from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Last week, North Korea fired its highest ever intercontinental ballistic missile test, continuing the regime's accelerated pace of nuclear missile testing, and of course raising many questions about how to avoid war on the Korean Peninsula. To answer some of those questions today, I'm joined by Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thanks for joining me, Peter.
My pleasure, Renee.
Now, first question, have we learnt anything new about North Korea's capabilities from the latest test?
Yes, I think we have. Every test shows that the North is getting more and more adept at refining the technology. And what's, I think, particularly interesting about this test is that it is a new missile. They're now calling it the Hwasong 15, which is bigger and heavier than previous missiles that have been used in the past. One of the things I find quite fascinating about the North is that, a lot of people assume that it's a backward country. One sees, oxen being used to plough fields. But when it comes to their missile technology, they're actually working extremely hard to develop high-tech capabilities. And they're quite public about it because you can see Kim Jong-un visiting factories to look at this new technology. This is not sort of clapped out 1960s Russian gear. They're actually developing their own stuff and have been for a number of years now. And in the latest launch, you can actually see that this is all coming together now to build, a fairly robust set of missile capabilities.
Does this latest test give us a more realistic timeline for when we'd have a fully realised North Korean nuclear missile ambition?
Well, the North is now saying that they've got it, which is that's been part of their propaganda over the last few days. I don't think that's right, and in fact there are estimates from missile analysts in the US and elsewhere saying that they're still some months away from having that reliable weapon which can accurately target even as big a target as an American city. So I think that somewhere within that. I've been saying 6 to 9 months. I've read other analysts saying about 12 months is what's necessary to give them that reliable capability. That's the sort of time frame we're talking about.
So Donald Trump has, of course, weighed in on Twitter, referring to North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un as Little Rocket Man and a sick puppy, which I thought was a new, interesting one. Outside of Trump's insults on Twitter, we've had United States responses calling for more economic sanctions, as well as China to do more. Are economic sanctions effective at this late stage?
Not if the purpose of sanctions is to get the North to cease its testing and come to the negotiation table soon. Julie Bishop, Australia's foreign minister, said, in fact, last week that the sanctions, although they were beginning to bite, were not having an immediate impact that would force the North to reconsider its position. And I think this is the problem, is that if sanctions are going to be effective, it's going to take a longer time for that to change the regime's behaviour than the time they need to perfect their weapons. And so really, if that's the reality, which is where I think we're at, we need another plan now to deal with the North, because sanctions is not going to modify their behaviour.
So a lot of people are putting pressure on China to do more about its neighbour. What has China's response been to the test?
Well, China has once again called for the North to denuclearise. China has been actually pretty strong in terms of implementing aspects of the UN sanctions. So, for example, they've cut down on the number of North Koreans that can go as foreign workers to work in mostly the garment industry in China. But actually, I don't think China is going to provide the solution to the West's problems. Everyone's saying that somehow it's China's role to sort of squeeze the North Korean economy. At the end of the day, I think the Chinese calculation is they're not going to do that. They're worried about the risk of millions of North Korean refugees coming across the border into their own country. They're even more worried about the thought that the regime might fall, and before you know it, you've got American troops right up against the border with China on the Yalu River. So China is going to squeeze their little friend, North Korea, but not to the point that it actually brings about regime change. I think this idea that China somehow has the solution in its hands is actually a bit of a myth. And again, we'll need to think differently if we're really going to change the North Koreans.
So we've ruled out economic sanctions as well as Chinese diplomatic efforts. What's left?
Two options. One option is, as increasingly we hear the United States talking about the US launches a preemptive military strike against the North's missile and nuclear infrastructure, and possibly more broadly, maybe even attempting to change the regime. Now that's a pretty unpalatable option because clearly the consequences of that will be many, many thousands of people killed and complete uncertainty about what happens on the peninsula after that time. Option number two is that we now perhaps try and have a talk to the North to see if it's possible to establish the basis for negotiations without some preconditions. And again, that's going to be pretty hard because there have not been direct sort of government-to-government contact between the Americans and the North Koreans for almost a decade. And in fact, there are very few examples where countries from the West have actually had high-level political engagement with North Korea. My own view is that it's probably time for us to think about that option. Because I would hate for the world to find itself in a situation where we might be at war on the Korean Peninsula without having tried to see if there is a peaceful negotiated solution. I don't necessarily say that that's going to be easy to find, but it's surely worth a try before we actually get into a conflict situation.
In terms of negotiating with North Korea, what is palatable for the West in terms of an outcome where North Korea gets what they want and we get what we want?
Well, at the moment, there's a complete mismatch of objectives. So the North has said that it's only prepared to talk to the West once it has assured its nuclear weapons capability. On the other hand, the American position is we'll only begin talks with you if you agree now to denuclearize. So you can see these two things are fairly incompatible. I thought last week, Renee, that we might have started to see some hints that the North is actually prepared to come to the negotiation table, and that it depends a little bit on how you read North Korean media. But in essence, after that Hwasong 15 test, the North said, "Well, we now have our assured nuclear capability. We've got what we want." As I said to you earlier, most analysts don't think that's actually true. So, is this a situation where the North is signalling to the United States, look, we know that we can't quite hit your cities with the reliability that we've claimed, but can we at least now start to talk about that as a possibility? Another little shred of evidence that's worth mentioning is that it would appear from American reporting that the North has been approaching a former senior NSA individual, Doug Powell. Doug was in the national security area in the Bush administration, and he recounts that he had something like 6 contacts with North Korean officials saying, "Hey, will you come to Pyongyang for us to have discussions?" And it all sort of just fell away into the sand at the end without actually taking place. But I think there are now some suggestions that the North is actually beginning to open the door. And what we need to know now is, are the Americans prepared to actually have that sort of discussion?
Well, if I can focus for a moment on the Australians, what should we be doing right now?
More than we are doing, which is really just calling for the North to denuclearise every time there's a rocket launch, and saying that sanctions must be allowed to work. It's clear that sanctions will not work in the time frame. So I think if Australia wants to play a useful role here, other than just sort of echoing from the sidelines with talking points, really what we should be doing is seeing if it's possible for us to open up some sort of dialogue with North Korea as well. We have an ambassador that is accredited to the North that is allowed to visit, or has not done so for some period of years. I think if it's too hard for the Americans to perhaps begin a process of negotiation, well, maybe we could at least start that discussion with the North. So that would be one thing that I would suggest. And a second thing would be to probably talk in more detail with the Americans than we have done so far about, so what is the nature of this plan for a strike? And I think, frankly, it's our role as a responsible ally to help the Americans in their own thinking about what might happen on the peninsula. And at the moment, I have a sense that we've been a bit reluctant even to talk to our American friends, because there's a sense of resistance to being dragged too deeply into American war planning.
From our own capability point of view, is Australia ready for a war on the Korean Peninsula?
No, I can say that without qualification. We do not have the capacity to send significant forces into the peninsula with the necessary chemical and biological defensive equipment that you would want to have, because the North is known to have large stocks of both chemical and biological weapons. So that's a problem. We're also really, I think, not going to be playing much of a role outside of intelligence cooperation if the US chooses to do a preemptive strike. So the kind of role that I think Australia would be called upon to play would be, some days after an initial strike, perhaps to be involved in some type of stabilisation task on the peninsula when, who knows what's left of the northern regime, or indeed what the casualty situation looks like in Seoul, and dealing with what is probably mass movements of South Koreans south of Seoul in the event of North Korean artillery bombardment. So Australia's involvement, I think, is probably going to be late in the piece if there is a military strike, and probably in those very early days just limited to intelligence cooperation.
Well, thank you for your time today, Peter, and thank you for watching. You can always read more on ASPI's blog, The Strategist, or follow us on Twitter at ASPI_org. There'll be links in the description.